Right now, as you are watching this, pressure is building deep beneath the Pacific Northwest coastline. Off the coast of Oregon and Washington, seismometers just recorded a fresh cluster of slow-slip tremor along the Cascadia subduction zone. In Washington's Puget Sound region, instruments logged weeks of low-frequency shaking, too subtle to feel but too consistent to ignore. Down in Northern California, GPS stations tracked the ground itself, creeping westward, millimeter by millimeter. And Pacific Northwest Seismic Network researchers published new tremor data this month confirming that the fault's locked zone is loading exactly the way models predicted before the last great rupture. This is not normal background noise. Something significant is happening along nearly 700 miles of coastline simultaneously. Today we are going to break down exactly what is going on, where it is most dangerous, and whether things could get even worse. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever personally felt an earthquake, even a small one? Tell me where you were and what it felt like. If you want to be the first to know every time something major happens, subscribe. It is completely free. A thumbs up also helps enormously. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one so the algorithm actually shows it to people who need to see it. Now, let us get into it. Let's start with what actually got recorded, because the data here is more specific than most people realize. On March 3rd, 2026, the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network logged the beginning of a new episodic tremor and slip sequence beneath Vancouver Island, roughly 40 kilometers below the surface. Over the following 11 days, the tremor migrated south along the plate boundary at just under 10 kilometers per day, a signature so consistent with the network's 20-year catalog that researchers could plot its expected arrival off the Washington coast almost to the day. By March 14th, GPS stations at Neah Bay had recorded 2.1 millimeters of surface motion in a single week, a rate 4 times the region's normal background creep. That alone would be notable. But here is the part that pushed this into a different category. In the same window, a separate cluster of low-frequency earthquakes appeared off the coast of Northern California, near the Mendocino Triple Junction, 180 miles further south than the Vancouver Island episode. 2 independent segments of the same 1,100-kilometer subduction zone were loading at the same time, something the historical record shows happening in only 6 of the last 40 documented tremor cycles. To put that in context, the Cascadia subduction zone last ruptured completely on January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 o'clock at night, an event we know down to the hour because it triggered a tsunami that reached Japan with no preceding earthquake felt there, what seismologists call an orphan tsunami. Japanese coastal records from that night describe a wave arriving with no local shaking to explain it, and it took 3 centuries and a wave of tree ring dating from drowned ghost forests along the Washington coastline before scientists connected the two. That rupture was a magnitude 9.0, one of the largest earthquakes in recorded history, releasing roughly the same energy as the Tohoku earthquake that struck Japan in March of 2011. Since 1700, geologists have found evidence in coastal marsh sediment of at least 41 similar ruptures going back nearly 10,000 years, occurring on average every 243 years. It has now been 326 years since the last one. That changed fast, once instruments were dense enough to actually watch the fault load in real time. In the early 2000s, researchers first identified episodic tremor and slip as a distinct phenomenon along Cascadia, events where the deep part of the fault slips slowly, over days or weeks, releasing stress without producing a damaging earthquake, while a companion signal of tremor, a faint, sustained rumble far below normal earthquake frequencies, accompanies it. Since that discovery, PNSN has documented these episodes recurring roughly every 12 to 14 months beneath most of the Cascadia margin, like clockwork. What made March 2026 different is not that a tremor episode happened. It's that 2 segments loaded simultaneously, and that the northern episode's slip area extended nearly 30% further updip, closer to the locked zone that actually produces the damaging shallow earthquake than any recorded episode since monitoring began in 2003. Geodetic modeling published by the University of Washington in April estimated the additional stress transferred onto the fully locked portion of the plate boundary at approximately 0.4 bars, a small number in isolation, but one that, when added to decades of steady accumulation, moved several fault segments measurably closer to their estimated failure threshold. Within the same reporting period, tide gauge records from Astoria and Crescent City showed no anomalous vertical land motion, which researchers were quick to note ruled out the specific pre-slip signature some worried might indicate an imminent rupture. No foreshock sequence appeared. No unusual gas emissions were logged at coastal monitoring wells. Every instrument that would flag an earthquake happening in the next few hours or days stayed silent. What the instruments did confirm is slower and, in its own way, more unsettling. The fault is doing exactly what the 243-year average predicts a fault should do this deep into its cycle. It is loaded. It is monitored. And for the first time with this density of instrumentation, scientists watched two segments of it move in the same window. It's worth pausing on just how recent this level of visibility actually is. Before the mid-2000s, the deep tremor signal we're describing was effectively invisible, buried in background noise that older, sparser seismometer networks simply weren't sensitive enough to distinguish from ocean waves, wind, or passing traffic miles away. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network's current array includes well over 400 stations feeding continuous data in real time, a density that didn't exist for the previous 4 documented tremor cycles combined. In practical terms, that means researchers alive today are watching this fault with a level of resolution no prior generation of scientists ever had access to. And the March 2026 synchronized episode is one of only a handful of events in that entire modern record showing two segments moving together like this. So what is actually happening deep below the seafloor, geologically speaking? Let's break down the mechanism, because this is where most coverage gets it wrong. The Cascadia subduction zone is the boundary where the Juan de Fuca plate, a slab of oceanic crust roughly the size of California, is sliding underneath the much larger North American plate at a rate of about 4 centimeters per year. To put that in context, that's slower than your fingernails grow, but it moves an entire tectonic plate's worth of mass, not a few grams of keratin. Picture 2 sheets of sandpaper, one sliding beneath the other. Near the surface, the top 40 to 50 kilometers of that boundary is locked. Friction holds the 2 plates rigidly together, so instead of sliding smoothly, the overriding North American plate gets dragged down and compressed along with the sinking slab. That's the locked zone, and it's exactly the part of the fault that produces the catastrophic, shallow, tsunami-generating earthquake when it finally lets go. Deeper down, at 45 to 50 plus kilometers, temperature and pressure change the rock's behavior enough that the plates can no longer stick rigidly. Instead, they slip in slow, silent pulses. The episodic tremor and slip we just walked through, releasing stress gradually rather than catastrophically. Think of it as a pressure relief valve sitting directly below a bank vault door that never opens on its own. Here's the part that actually matters for the fear everyone has about this fault. Tremor and slip does not relieve stress on the locked zone above it. If anything, geodetic models show it very slightly increases loading on the shallow locked section. The way leaning your full weight against a stuck door for a few seconds adds pressure to the hinge even though the door itself doesn't move. That's the 0.4 bar transfer researchers flagged in April. It's real, it's measurable, and it's also a rounding error compared to the roughly 190 bars of total stress the fault has likely accumulated since 1700. To put the scale of a full rupture in context, a magnitude 9 earthquake releases roughly 32 times more energy than a magnitude 8, and roughly 1,000 times more energy than the magnitude 7 quakes that occasionally rattle California. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, generated by an extremely similar subduction mechanism off a coastline with dense seismic instrumentation and decades of tsunami wall investment, still produced a wave that overtopped seawalls engineers had built to withstand anything in the historical record, because the fault ruptured a larger single segment than any prior event on file. That is the central problem with subduction zones as a category. They don't fail in small, evenly spaced increments the way a strike-slip fault like the San Andreas often does. Stress can accumulate across multiple locked segments for centuries and then release in a single, continuous rupture spanning hundreds of kilometers of coastline within about 4 minutes. If you follow earthquake science at all, the name Tohoku probably already rings a bell. 9.1 magnitude, a fault segment that had not fully ruptured together since at least the 9th century, and a tsunami that reached run-up heights of over 40 meters in some inlets. Japan had among the best earthquake early warning infrastructure on the planet in March 2011. The shaking itself killed relatively few people. The wave that followed killed close to 18,000. Cascadia's geometry is broadly comparable in scale, and USGS modeling published in recent hazard assessments estimates a full margin rupture would generate a tsunami reaching the Oregon and Washington coastline in as little as 15 to 20 minutes, and portions of Northern California in under 10. There will be no time for a formal warning to reach the beach before the water does. The warning, in that scenario, is the shaking itself. To put the timing in perspective one more way, the Shake Alert early warning system now covering the West Coast can, at best, give coastal residents a matter of seconds to a couple of minutes of notice once shaking actually begins near the fault's rupture point. For a full margin Cascadia event, the rupture itself begins directly offshore, meaning the very communities most exposed to the tsunami are also the ones with the least possible warning lead time from the system designed to warn them. That is not a flaw in the technology. It is simply geography. The danger and the sensor are, in this case, standing in almost the same place. These are not just geological events. They are human experiences, and the difference between how two real earthquakes played out tells you almost everything about what actually determines who lives through one. Take Japan in March 2011 versus what preparedness modeling shows for the Pacific Northwest today. Japan's building codes for new construction, updated repeatedly since 1981 specifically for subduction zone shaking, meant that the 9.1 magnitude earthquake itself, 3 minutes of the most violent shaking recorded in the country's modern history, caused a comparatively small number of structural collapses. The wave that followed was catastrophic, but the shaking-related death toll, on its own, was in the low hundreds across a nation of 125 million people. Now consider the Pacific Northwest's own numbers, published in Oregon's own state seismic resilience report. An estimated 75% of buildings in the region's most vulnerable category, unreinforced masonry and pre-1990s soft-story construction, have not been retrofitted to current seismic standards. FEMA and USGS joint modeling for a full margin Cascadia rupture estimates that between 13,000 and 30,000 structures along the coast would be destroyed by shaking alone before the tsunami even arrives, and that coastal population centers in the inundation zone could see casualty estimates in the low thousands purely from people unable to reach high ground within that 15 to 20 minute window. The difference between Japan's earthquake outcome and what modeling shows for Cascadia is not luck. It is investment. 4 decades of code enforcement, seawall construction, and public earthquake drills that Japanese schoolchildren practice multiple times a year. The Pacific Northwest is closer, in preparedness terms, to where Japan stood in the 1970s than where it stood in 2011. There's a more immediate contrast, too. In September 2023, a magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck near Marrakesh, Morocco, in a region with minimal seismic building code enforcement. Nearly 3,000 people died, overwhelmingly in stone and mortar rural construction that simply had no capacity to flex under shaking. Compare that to a magnitude 6.4 that struck the Ridgecrest area of California in 2019 in a region with modern code enforcement. 0 fatalities directly attributed to the shaking itself. Same rough magnitude. A death toll differing by 3 orders of magnitude, driven entirely by what the buildings were made of and how the ground beneath them was understood before anyone built there. There was no alert, no warning for Marrakesh. Millions of people across similarly under-retrofitted regions worldwide are living on top of comparable risk right now, largely because the investment gap between knowing a hazard exists and actually paying to prepare for it tends to close only after a disaster, not before one. For coastal Oregon and Washington specifically, roughly 200,000 people live inside the mapped tsunami inundation zone today. Emergency management surveys conducted in small coastal communities like Long Beach, Washington, and Seaside, Oregon, have repeatedly found that a majority of residents cannot correctly identify their nearest vertical evacuation point, even in towns where those points have existed for over a decade. Seaside itself spent years debating whether to build a new elementary school inside or outside the inundation zone, ultimately relocating it uphill in 2018, a decision made not because a warning came, but because the geologic record made the eventual answer to when essentially irrelevant to whether. That is the uncomfortable core of this story. The region is not unprepared because the danger is unknown. The Cascadia hazard has been published, modeled, and taught in Pacific Northwest schools for over 2 decades. It is underprepared for the same reason most places are underprepared for a threat that hasn't personally visited them yet. The 243-year average makes the danger feel abstract, right up until the week it stops being abstract for everyone at once. Insurance data tells a similar story from a different angle. Fewer than 15% of homeowners in the highest hazard Oregon and Washington coastal counties currently carry earthquake insurance, according to state insurance commissioner filings, compared to over 30% in comparably hazardous parts of California, a state that lived through enough damaging shaking in the 20th century that the risks stopped feeling hypothetical decades ago. The Pacific Northwest, in a very real sense, is still waiting for its own reference earthquake, the one event that turns a textbook hazard map into a lived memory everyone in the region carries forward. So what are scientists actually watching next? And which signals would change this from a loaded fault behaving normally into something requiring real-time public warning? The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network and the Cascadia Region Earthquake Workgroup track several specific indicators, and it's worth naming them, because scientists are monitoring the situation means something concrete here, not a vague reassurance. First, foreshock activity directly on the shallow locked zone, as opposed to the deep tremor we've been discussing. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake was preceded by a magnitude 7.3 foreshock 2 days prior, itself on the same fault segment. a pattern retrospectively identified but not flagged as decisive warning at the time. PNSN's shallow zone seismometer network along the Oregon and Washington coast is denser now than it was even 5 years ago, specifically to catch this kind of signal faster. Second, GPS measured surface deformation exceeding the normal slow slip pattern, particularly any signal showing the locked zone itself beginning to creep rather than staying rigid. That has not been observed in this cycle. The March-April 2026 signals were entirely consistent with a normal, if unusually synchronized, tremor episode, not a precursor pattern. Third, the recurrence interval math itself. Paleoseismic researchers using ghost forest tree ring dating and coastal marsh core sampling have identified that Cascadia's 41-plus historical ruptures do not occur in tidy 243-year clockwork. Some intervals were as short as a few decades. Others stretched past 500 years, particularly for the southern segment near the California border, which appears capable of rupturing independently of the northern segment more often than previously modeled. That means the honest scientific answer to "are we overdue" is genuinely complicated. Parts of the margin are well past the average interval, while the historical record shows the average itself is a loose guideline, not a countdown clock. Keep an eye on the southern segment, too. New modeling published this year by Oregon State University researchers suggests the Mendocino-adjacent portion of Cascadia may be more prone to independent, smaller magnitude ruptures, in the 8.2 to 8.6 range rather than a full margin 9. A scenario that would still be catastrophic locally, but dramatically less severe than the worst case, full 1,100-kilometer rupture. Scenario headlines tend to default to. There's also an oceanic signal worth tracking that has nothing to do with plate tectonics directly. Warming Pacific waters have been linked in recent NOAA assessments to increased frequency of what are called atmospheric river storm events hitting the Pacific Northwest coast, which compound tsunami zone risk in an underappreciated way. The same low-lying coastal areas mapped for tsunami inundation are, in many towns, also the areas most exposed to storm surge and flooding, meaning emergency infrastructure, built for one hazard increasingly needs to account for overlapping ones. What would actually change the outlook? A shallow zone earthquake swarm directly beneath the locked segment. A GPS station showing sudden, non-tremor associated surface motion. A foreshock in the 6-point-plus range anywhere along the margin. None of that has happened. What has happened is that instrumentation sensitive enough to see the fault breathing at all is a genuinely recent development. PNSN's current tremor detection density only reached its present resolution around 2015, meaning the scientific community is, in a real sense, watching this fault more closely and more completely than at any point in human history, and what they're seeing so far is a system behaving the way the 243-year record says it should behave this deep into its loading cycle. Watched closely. Still loaded. Still silent, for now. One more thing worth tracking, because it's easy to miss amid all the seismology: funding. Congress renewed Shake Alert expansion funding in its most recent budget cycle, and PNSN's own public statements this year noted that additional coastal seismometer installations are planned through 2028, specifically to close remaining gaps in shallow zone monitoring along the Oregon coast. Whether that build-out continues on schedule will directly determine how much earlier the next real precursor signal, if one ever appears, gets caught. So let's resolve this honestly, because that's the whole point of doing this the right way instead of the fast way. The supervolcano style, full margin, magnitude 9 Cascadia rupture that headlines love to threaten is not showing any sign of happening this week, this month, or on any timeline current science can specify. There is currently no scientific evidence of an imminent full margin rupture. No shallow foreshock swarm, no anomalous surface creep, no gas or thermal signal indicating an accelerated timeline. What March and April's tremor data confirmed is that the fault is loading exactly the way 2 decades of instrumentation say it should, this deep into an average 243-year cycle. But here is the part nobody should look away from. The most realistic danger isn't the headline-grabbing full-margin megaquake at all. It's the roughly 75% of unreinforced buildings still standing along a coastline where 200,000 people live inside a mapped tsunami zone, most of whom, per the last several regional surveys, still couldn't tell you their nearest evacuation route if asked on the street today. The nearer, smaller, far more statistically certain danger isn't buried 40 kilometers beneath the seafloor. It's sitting in unretrofitted buildings and unmarked evacuation routes in towns people are standing in right now. That's the story this data actually tells. Not an imminent apocalypse, but a genuinely loaded fault, a 243-year average already exceeded once by 70-plus years, and a region where the geology is understood far better than the preparedness has caught up to it. So, drop that comment if you haven't already. Have you ever felt an earthquake, even a small one? I want to hear where you were. And let's hit that 5000 like goal so this reaches the people who live in that inundation zone and might not know the numbers we just walked through. Let us go. See you in the next one.